Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Welcome back to another episode of Neuroverse. Today we're going to be discussing cognitive ontology, and what we mean by that is basically how do we define our set of cognitive functions and how does that relate to brain areas and brain activity.
Cool.
So to get us started, I wanted to explain a little bit about what ontology really means. So in philosophy, the term ontology is often just used to deal with like the nature of being. So people often talk about ontology versus epistemology. So whereas epistemology has to do with the nature of knowledge, ontology has to do with the nature of existence and being. Mm-hmm. And when we then apply ontology to cognition, though, it takes a slightly different meaning. And what it really means is, how do we categorize the constituents of our minds? So what is the vocabulary that we can use to understand the functional organization of our psychology and of our cognitive abilities? And another way to think about it is also, what are the things that go wrong in mental health or neurological disorders? And also, the concept of a cognitive ontology is somewhat inspired by the more commonly known gene ontology, which is a system that scientists have come up with and all use nowadays to divide genes based on their function and biological pathways that they're involved in. And in this way, different genes across species, which can be slightly different at the nanoscale, but carry out the same function, can be compared across studies. And this highlights the purpose of an ontology for making research findings more translational across studies and making sure that research can be compared across different labs across the world. So that, well, from a neuroscience perspective, for example, we can understand which cognitive areas of function we want to further understand.
Yeah, it's really relevant and important, and I feel like especially with fields like neuroscience and psychology, there's a lot of redundancy in reinventing the wheel and a lot of miscommunication, because like in psychology you may use terms like mentalizing or theory of mind, etc., whereas in neuroscience we may use different terms for that.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly good example actually, because the concept of theory of mind is one of the ones that has the most different terms that are used, like mentalizing, as you said, or perspective taking, or cognitive empathy. Also, the concept of empathy actually refers to like many different types of empathy normally. Yeah, I think, as you said, that translational aspect is really challenging because the field of psychology is also older than the field of neuroscience. Mm-hmm. So we're attempting to apply a lot of like traditional terms that people often describe as being folksy, like folk psychology, and these kind of abstract concepts that have been used from the 1800s, and we're trying to apply that to our modern neuroscience techniques and basically finding that it fails.
Yeah, and also the fact that whereas in, for example, genes, you may be translating across species, but you're not really translating across fields, whereas with things like philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience all operate in very different modalities. Like in neuroscience, you quantify things in a very different way than you do in psychology, and in philosophy, like you don't quantify things. And they all try and discuss and approach the same topic, but from different angles, and then I guess using different terminology doesn't help either with a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you think, which direction should research be geared in to like facilitate that translation between neuroscience and psychology and philosophy. But yeah, like I did some research into the history of a cognitive ontology, and it goes quite far back to the 1700s when philosophers such as Thomas Reid proposed a faculty psychology, which is where the mind is divided into distinct innate mental powers that are each responsible for a specific cognitive function. And this contrasted to like the prevailing belief that the mind was essentially a passive receptor of sensory information, because Reid was one of the first to suggest that instead there are active mental processes happening. And these mental faculties included things like memory, abstraction, perception, reasoning, imagination, etc., which kind of intuitively makes sense to me as categories that we still use nowadays.
A lot more developed than what Plato initially argued to be like that the soul has three parts: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive part.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that as well, and I was like, to categorize it into three is, quite vague.
Yeah. It reminds me of Freud a little bit with ego, id, and superego.
Yeah, true. And then another quite ancient, maybe not ancient, but old concept is phrenology, which is, you've probably seen like those images of the human head divided into sections with like words defining each bit. Basically, people used to believe that like different parts of the skull represented different things, and so based on the shape of your head, essentially you could tell if you were smarter or if you were better at maths or if you enjoyed specific hobbies or whatever. And Franz Gall was a famous phrenologist who basically advocated, again, for mental faculties, but he defined 27 specific ones. And I found it really interesting reading these 27 ones because these are very not intuitive. There were some that did make sense, like memory, and he divided them into memory for specific things like memory for words, memory for people, and then also like a sense of place, a sense of color, love and affection for friends, or love and affection for family. But then there were some really strange ones, like talent for poetry, your ability to mimic other people, talent for architecture, and a sense of connectedness between numbers, which I think are such like abstract concepts.
Yeah.
That I find it interesting that they're only 27. Like, that's not loads. And a talent for poetry, I think that potentially reflect things that were highly valued in society maybe at the time.
Yeah, I think it would be extremely challenging to tell someone's ability to be good at architecture from the size of their brain.
Yeah, but then you could kind of understand the logic, and that might be related to like logical or rational abilities. I don't know. Yeah, it's good we've come a long way from it, but at the same time, with certain tools that we use nowadays, like EEG and neuroimaging, like I think you need to be careful with how you interpret that data. Yeah, so I think that highlights, well, two interesting things that I questioned when reflecting on this topic were, should our cognitive ontology be based on neuroscientific findings now that neuroscience is much more prevalent and we have so much more data? Or another way to put this is, should we distrust our cognitive ontology because it comes from a folk psychology rather than neuroscience? Interestingly, one of the first proposals that scientific progress would actually replace our set of cognitive ontologies was suggested by Patricia and Paul Churchland, who are two famous philosophers that advocated for something called eliminative materialism in the 1980s, which argues that common sense concepts and mental states don't actually correspond to anything real, and eventually neuroscientific concepts will take over.
I really disagree with that. Yeah. Like, fundamentally.
I also disagree with it, but why?
Because basically you're judging one subject with the rules of another, like you're judging psychology with the scientific method and vice versa. And like if someone says, I'm in pain, you're expressing a sentiment, you're expressing yourself. But even if you find out the exact mechanism, the exact circuitry, you would never say like, oh, my amygdala is lighting up, or my limbic system is like slightly upticked. You know, the way that you express yourself and the vocabulary that you use and the psychology behind it is going to be separate from the neuroscience. You can still have the neuroscience and you can have the psychology, but one doesn't need to replace the other to serve its function.
Yeah, that's true. And I think pain is a really good example of that, because we know that pain is a really complex process that involves a lot of integration of information, both from the periphery to the brain and then brain top-down information, and it doesn't necessarily require either or to occur, and we can't really map that sensation to brain activity. And so following their logic, would that suggest pain actually doesn't exist as a cognitive concept? So there is a lot of controversy, and that is mainly because some people argue that there should be a large-scale ontological revision that is necessary for the reasons we just described, for the terminology being too intuitive, folksy, unscientific. But others argue that we don't need that. And I think the problem is that for those who argue that we should revise our vocabulary, they then normally say that that should be backed by neuroscientific evidence. And one way to do this is through functional neuroimaging, so looking at human brain activity during tasks that try to isolate specific cognitive functions. And here there's two main problems. The first is that it's becoming increasingly clear that structural or functional features of the brain do not map to our current cognitive ontology, as we've kind of suggested. And an example of this is there was a group of people who did a meta-analysis of hundreds of fMRI studies of several different cognitive constructs, including working memory, response selection, task switching, response inhibition, and more. And then they trained a machine learning classifier to see if they could reliably discriminate patterns of brain activity associated with each construct. And kind of promisingly, this classifier was actually able to distinguish most of the cognitive concepts, but not task switching. And so the authors then suggested that task switching should be removed from our cognitive ontology. And I know that task switching is an area of neuroscience, mouse behavioral research that is heavily studied. And so not that this meta-analysis is going to provide all the answers, of course, because it of course depends on the nature of their machine learning classifier and the studies that they chose. And this is just one example of how you may approach trying to understand which cognitive ontologies are more neuroscientifically reliable, but not great that task switching was one that was highlighted as not able to be mapped onto brain activity.
Yeah, I think that the fact that they decided to rule out task switching kind of shows the limitation of their classifier and the way that they're doing this functional neuroimaging. And also,
well, I mean, maybe, but like...
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, for example, if you take the basal ganglia, which is a brain region involved in decision making, by extension, we could also maybe relate it to like task switching. Like, how do we decide that this action is no longer favorable? Let me change the strategy and therefore task switch. And the basal ganglia has two types of dopamine neurons, and they're peppered throughout the brain and they act in opposition to each other. And so I think that could show that with more complex things perhaps, or with something that is a bit in this way like salt and pepper mixed, that you can't look at task switching because the same neurons are involved, but they just take turns being in front or behind. And I guess that shows a little bit like the limitations of classifying it this way.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting point of like, we obviously have a much more detailed understanding of these cognitive functions in animals because we can interrogate their brains and look at neuronal subpopulations and even to the molecular scale. And we can't do that in humans. And so, yeah, you are limited by the neuroimaging data that you have, which doesn't have a very high resolution, and you can't isolate specific subpopulations. Another thing also is we're not going into the details of this study, or this was a meta-analysis, but of the studies that they looked at within that meta-analysis, different people would have processed their data differently. What do they mean by brain activity? Is that like isolated to specific regions or throughout? of course, all of these variables are going to contribute to your interpretation of how that maps to function. So in my opinion, though, we should be using like human studies to guide what we choose to look at in rodents, because otherwise we can accumulate all of this data and understand how a specific subtype of neuron is contributing to this very specific task in mice, for example. But what that actually means for behavior as a whole needs to be like interpreted clearly. And so it would be cool if we could kind of use our human data to understand maybe which constructs we should be targeting more. Yeah. Like which functions we should be trying to understand better.
Yeah. I think it's important to think about the questions that we want to probe in mouse models. And I think, starting with humans is a really good point, at least for my own personal interests. But I think I would take it from a more philosophical or psychological standpoint. Like there's this question in psychology, like sympathy or mentalizing, or it's anything, theory of mind. Can we probe that in
all synonyms of each other?
Yeah. Can we probe that in neuroscientific terms? We can't do that in humans. We'll probe it in a mouse brain. But I don't think that using human data necessarily to inform the questions you ask in mice, I mean, sometimes I think it can be positive, but other times I think you can miss the limitations. Like if you just used human data, you'd think, well, there's no point in looking at task switching because this is clearly something that doesn't happen. When we know that it is something that does happen, we just can't capture it with the non-invasive technologies we have for humans.
Yeah, but it's more about the interpretation of like, when you design a task, what are you actually isolating? Because otherwise you could fail to extract anything meaningful, because like if your task is actually engaging several different cognitive functions, so to speak. Like I don't believe there is an actual set of cognitive functions that are all discrete, but I think that it might help to be able to tease them apart better, so that you're not just understanding something very vague that happens. It's like in memory research, people used to just think of memory. But now we know that there's many different types of memory, like episodic memory of events, procedural memory of skills, semantic memory of facts, and context-dependent memory now we know is very heavily relying on the hippocampal structure. And before, everyone thought that the hippocampus was just like the seat of memory, but it's more fine-grained than that. And now we're starting to understand that the hippocampus actually has this huge role in spatial cognition and understanding where you are in space. And that also relates to how we build a map of ourselves in the world, and therefore egocentric representation. That is maybe a concept of cognitive function that actually belongs to several cognitive functions as we currently know them. But perhaps we need to understand these mental concepts in a slightly different way that is catering to what we've discovered from neuroscience, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that we no longer just think of memory as being memory, but we now have a more specific concept of a spatial representation of ourselves in the world that could be applied to theory of mind. It could be applied to episodic memory. It could be applied to many different things. You get what I mean?
Yeah. I agree with you that I think that it's difficult to tease all of these cognitive functions apart, but that neuroscience may help a little bit with that.
I think it's interesting how neuroscience can actually change our perception. Mm-hmm. So rather than just having like this vague idea of memory, we can understand it in quite a different way, that it's not just like we can divide memory into 100 different parts, but rather that we can understand that we have a conceptualization of our relation to people and things in our environments. And that as a concept, it can be a cognitive function rather than episodic memory or theory of mind that concept actually also applies to. Another example is a place in the brain called Broca's area, because it was discovered by a guy called Broca, that is known to be really important in speech production. So if you have lesions in that area, you're unable to produce speech. But it's also increasingly been found that it was implicated in other functions, like using tools, comprehending arm gestures, or syntax, comprehension. And these all seem like kind of different functions. But there was a paper that claimed that Broca's involvement in these seemingly different processes could be explained by the fact that they all have something in common, which is that they all involve the representation of hierarchical structures. So like this is particularly prevalent in grammatical and syntax rules. And I thought that was interesting because kind of highlighting this, that we can actually use like interpreting the function of different brain areas to reconceptualize how we function, because it may be something more abstract like hierarchical processing than something more intuitive like speech.
Yeah. And I do think that neuroscience has helped both inform what memory is and all of the different aspects of it, like working, episodic, etc., and vice versa. I think that, you know, a lot of neuroscience experiments come from psychology and behavioral paradigms, and so then we are able to like probe, and it's quite circular.
Yeah, and I also think that we've mentioned this a lot now, but there's a whole idea, potentially problem, of brain areas, and I think it's a very human tendency to want to map everything one-to-one from structure to function. Essentially, this whole conversation is actually a structure-function debate.
As they always are.
Yeah. And the problem is that there are brain regions that are more involved in specific functions and tasks, and we know that, but as I mentioned also before, like an increasing number of studies are basically trying to use data of brain activity patterns and like see if you can use that data to predict a particular outcome, a function or whatever.
Yeah.
And the problem is we're realizing more and more that activity from other brain regions that are not specialized in a specific task are also able to decode that task. So for example, like a visual perception isn't only encoded in the visual region. If you also had a recording site in any other part of the cortex, there's also some sort of specificity of the activity there. And so it's a problem of multifunctionality of these brain areas, which I think really relates to this thing about the hippocampus that I mentioned, because I think it's just a particularly good example of it, because I think, yeah, like there's just this wanting to be like, the amygdala is responsible for fear, the hippocampus is responsible for memory, but maybe by understanding the actual function of each brain region, instead of that being a limitation for our understanding, it can be like used to kind of reinterpret how does the brain compute you know, information, and how does that then define how we function as behaving organisms. Like for example, the concept of predictive coding, which is becoming increasingly used in neuroscience, we didn't really perceive our function of the brain as being like a predictive machine that uses prior information and new information to continuously create this model of the world. And now that we have this model that is happening in us, it also makes us rethink how the brain functions. And so all in all, I think to me that really highlights the value of computational neuroscience and understanding instead the computational power of the brain and maybe different regions of the brain and how they also interact across regions, breaking that brain region confined thinking, to understand the function of the brain, and then the function of the brain can then more easily be mapped onto behavior, because that computation in a way is somewhat translational.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I have such an appreciation for systems neuroscience, in that we're not just studying brain regions in isolation, we're moving to study brain regions in relation to one another. And we can do that because the technology is finally here. Like we can finally probe at these things. Before, the technology was more limited, so that's also, I think, yes, humans have a tendency to want to pattern everything and map everything, and that's why we assigned those brain regions with those functions, but we were also limited with the technologies, and now we can look at things in a bit more in relation to one another. And I think also it highlights why Paul and Patricia Churchland's problem is so faulty, because see, even now we're at a point where we can't say no. Like, amygdala is not the center of fear. You can't just say like my amygdala is activated if I'm saying I'm scared. Like you wouldn't talk like that. So
well, I think yeah, and beyond that, it's also just, I think in a way that's giving too much credit to science, because it's assuming that science really is ground truth. Or I understand their reasoning in that science doesn't necessarily have to be ground truth now, but it eventually will be once we get like a fuller idea of how things work. But like ultimately science is also just another way that we perceive how things work through observation. So yeah, I don't think it's right to assume that just by better and better observations, which is basically scientific progress, that one day we will understand how we function as it actually is.
Yeah. It's also, not acknowledging the fact that science is continuously updating itself. So then if the claim is that neuroscience is going to overwrite psychology, well, it seems a bit silly if in a few years it just keeps updating. Like it would make more sense to keep psychology separate, given neuroscience is not completely foolproof and will continuously be updating.
I actually was reading this article about this topic, which I'll definitely include in the show notes because it was very interesting and comprehensive. And they kind of ended by arguing that we should just have what they call a taxonomic pluralism. That basically we should just have different cognitive ontologies depending on what the aim is for researchers.
Yeah.
Which is also maybe easier said than done, but it's true that you do need to be flexible in how these terms are applied. And another point that is heavily related to that is that a huge limitation is the tasks that we do normally use in functional experiments, both in humans and mice and other animals. But there are some like very commonly known tasks, like the Stroop task, where you have words spelling out a color but in a different color, and then you have to say the color that the words are, not the one that it's reading. And these different tasks can and have been used to study different things across different studies. Like some people will say the Stroop task is a measure of response inhibition, but then some people will be like, oh, it's response selection, and some others are like, oh no, it's conflict detection. And then that's where it's like, oh, it's really just a matter of semantics. So it's important to just understand what the task is, perhaps isolating, and then if you accumulate all the studies that have done this specific task and you use the task being the shared thing to then be able to compare the results, but then the cognitive ontology terminologies are really like just going to influence how you then interpret it. So in the future, the way that we can use the cognitive ontologies being revised is by designing tasks that address specific ontologies better.
Yeah. I think in general, like you said, there are a few tasks that are really well known, and that even just by saying the name, like go-no-go tasks, bandit tasks, those that are in the field know exactly like, oh, a bandit task is looking at probabilistic decision making, or like a go-no-go task is looking at, I don't know, decision making.
Or like inhibition.
Yeah.
Response inhibition.
Yeah. So I think in a way like ontology can be preserved through these tasks and the nomenclature that we give them. But you're right in that different scientists can interpret them in different ways depending on what their experimental question is.
Yeah. A problem then would more be if people are actually not doing the same tasks.
Yeah.
Like what's beautiful about a lot of behavioral neuroscience is people do similar tasks, but then they look at completely different things, so you then can compare like, for example, activity across several different brain regions or whatever.
Yeah. I read that article about taxonomy and the pluralism of ontology, and they mentioned something about the taxonomy of delusions. And again, this is another structure function debate where they basically say that oftentimes delusions are taxonomized by the content of aberrant beliefs instead of the underlying cognitive etiology. I think they're trying to compare basically the symptoms versus the diagnosed condition, and how should it be classified as? Like, should it be classified as the expression of the delusion, or is it the the name we give it to that condition, like schizophrenia or depression or something else.
Could you just clarify what the two ways that we can define delusions are?
Yeah, so they're looking at either the symptoms expressed or the cause of those symptoms. So that's what they mean by cognitive etiology.
Right, that makes sense. So like whether delusions that are associated with different mental disorders can be classed as the same thing?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting. Also related to autism and schizophrenia and other things, but I think those are two disorders that are really good examples of a lot of different potential symptoms, because you have like delusions and hallucinations, and then the negative symptoms. In schizophrenia and autism you have not only like repetitive behaviors and social difficulties, but also sensory differences, and like everyone presents differently. And should we be defining the disorders based on like the cognitive functions impairments, and can we like subdivide the disorders, or should the disorder just be like an umbrella term that relates to all these different functions, which is how we currently see it? Is it always the same thing across different disorders?
Yeah.
Like if there's different genetic disorders, for example, that leads to the same functional outcome, then can that really be defined as a set function if multiple different changes can lead to the same outcome? Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I guess gets to the crux of cognitive ontology and how we should be framing our research, and whether it should be in like a bottom-up approach, like going from like the gene brain region to behavior, or from a top-down approach from cognitive function back down to what genes are responsible for that. It's interesting though, because they did this meta-analysis and they found that a purely content-based taxonomy is empirically problematic because it lumps together delusions that ought to be separated. So they're arguing that even though there are delusions in common with many different types of disorders, that it doesn't allow for sufficient, I guess, granularity to then be able to address the specific needs of these specific disorders. But it was still a really interesting point that they raised. So yeah, one of the final points that they make, and my interpretation of that point, is they say atlases, not maps. And I think that is a really interesting way of thinking about how we approach cognitive ontology and using neuroscience as a tool to define cognition, in that with neuroscience we have been able to create all of these amazing maps of the brain, and with psychology as well, but we need to think of it as a whole, as an atlas. And so it's not about whether one discipline overwrites another, it's actually all of them bring something to the table. And going back to taxonomic pluralism, how this is an advantage, not a, what's the opposite of it? Not a limitation. Not a limitation. Yeah, definitely. And I think that should be the goal, to like integrate what we already know moving forward, rather than like coming up with a whole new interpretation kind of from scratch. But I still think it is important to have a sort of shared cognitive ontology and like try to move away from using lots of different terms that actually mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's really hard because research is like spread out across the whole world. So like this is not gonna be easy. Yeah, and also there's this guy, Russ Poldrack, who's like a strong proponent for going towards a new cognitive ontology, but he also created a platform called Cognitive Atlas, which you can find at cognitiveatlas.org, not sponsored. It's kind of like a Wikipedia for cognitive science. Yeah, and it's kind of similar to the Gene Ontology platform as well, where it tries to integrate the information across many, many different studies and show our shared cognitive ontology. So I recommend like checking it out if this topic interests you. And also Russ Poldrack has done some really interesting talks and research on this topic. So I just wanted to say that. But yeah, I think all in all, researching for this and thinking about the topic like re-emphasized to me the value of neuroscience, which was really nice. I don't think that we should trash all of our psychology knowledge, because I think that there are some really interesting concepts that psychology has come up with. I mean, to me, that's kind of the purpose of psychology, for like conceptualizing the way we think. But the ability to integrate that together with what we know the function of the brain is interesting. I also think in school and even in undergraduate, they kind of teach you that like this is the speech area, this is the motor area, this is the sensory area, because that's the easiest way to understand the brain.
Yeah.
And then that starts to break down as you discover more. And especially as we discussed, like with a more computational framework, I think everything kind of changes.
Yeah, it's true that neuroscience has changed a lot throughout the years, and that a few years ago we thought of it as a very like brain region to function specific mapping, and now there's a much greater focus on the computations that the brain does and looking at it with a greater lens. And I'm really excited to see where it's going to go in the future and how the field is going to develop into a way that we'll think about the brain differently and its function and how that relates to cognitive ontology.
Yeah, and with that, we'll end today's episode. Thank you very much for listening. And if you enjoyed it, tell your friends and family about Neuroverse and follow us on social media at neuroverse_pod. And for more information, check out our website, neuroversepod.com.